my work. Thank you, Sinfree. I just want to start with a disclaimer that my internet connection is very bad. So if I freeze or disappear, don't worry, I will come back because I just need to shift to another kind of connection that I have in case of malfunction of the other one. So I have to say that I feel quite intimidated by the group that is here. Lots of my, the people that I respect the most are in the audience, and I thought it would be just a small reading group. So I have to say I am quite, intimidated and, but also very happy. So I realize that what I'm gonna see here now is going to become then public and posted on YouTube, and it's fine. I just want to say that my presentation is going to be quite personal, and I am happy to go on record about what I'm going to say now. But instead of talking about my articles, which you have access to, and of course we can discuss my articles during the Q&A session, I just want to speak to them, looking back at them from the perspective I have now, with taking a little bit of distance. So I am going to share my screen. Doesn't seem to be able to share screen. Let me just see. Okay.
Tommaso, I made you a co-host, so I assume now you will be able to share your screen.
You're muted.
Can you still hear me? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Can you still hear me? Okay, great. I'm so sorry, and I'm sure. So you should be able to see my screen.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
And I'm gonna do slideshow. I don't worry about it. I just have a very few slides. I realize that I've been told that I only have 10-15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So these two articles could be read together under the umbrella term of queering multilingualism. So if I look back at these articles, but also if I look back at anything I do, it's informed by affect, more specifically by anger. I'm always angry. I'm angry at a lot of things. And we know that anger has been used in a variety of movements, including the queer movements of the 80s, during a specific time when HIV and AIDS became increasingly more handled in quite a bad way, especially in the US and in the UK and the rest of the world. But the US and the UK were particular times because it was Reagan and in the US. So I would say that I go back to those years, and I can say that the kind of, although I was an adolescent, I was, rage has something that kind of I carry with me all the time, queer rage. And so a writer that has always influenced me is Michael Warner, who describes queer as a stance that rejects the minoritizing logic of toleration or simple political interest representation in favor of a more thorough resistance to regimes of the normal. if one wants to use a motto, you could say, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck you. So that's more or less what characterizes everything I do. I do not necessarily want to be accepted. I do not want to be tolerated, both as a human being or as an academic. But I try to go against the grain as much as I can. So what is this anger about, especially at this specific historical juncture? Well, I'm often angry about politics, so about the injustices of anti-queer politics. And here we can see, especially in Sweden at the moment, huge backlashes against what we thought we had achieved over many decades of LGBT and queer activism. So you would have, for example, someone, and here it's written in Swedish, a professor of philosophy, publishing an article in one of the main Swedish dailies saying that dispossessed groups have become the new saints, and kind of bemoaning the fact, that queer scholarship has become increasingly more vocal in Sweden. And of course, he's white and heterosexual and middle class and so on. And he's very annoyed about all these queer, not just queer scholars, but critical race scholars. He's angry about any form of critical research. But I'm also angry. I'm also angry against those forms of politics that have co-opted LGBT rights into nationalism. So in a sense, I am angry about countries, for example, like Israel, but also the Netherlands, Sweden, the US, that use LGBT rights to then create new forms of discriminations against other groups. And I'm sure for those of you who have read my work about Israel-Palestine, Israel markets itself as this heaven in the Middle East for gay and lesbian rights. And of course, Israel is, to a certain extent, very progressive with regard to LGBT rights. But the question is that how is it used then to kind of play down the discrimination against Palestinians? Then I'm also angry about those who have done work on Israeli homonationalism, and in a sense, because as Saed Atshan has said with a wonderful book that has just been published, which I strongly recommend you to read, Queer Palestine in the Empire of Critique, Saed kind of makes the point very clearly that critical scholarship about Israel-Palestine has constructed what he calls an empire of critique. That is, it has been a form of scholarship that is just so quick to issue a verdict of guilty against some, that then we are not open to accept the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So like Saed says, I'm very much in line with what he says, activism at the intersection of LGBTQ and Palestinian rights can reveal the potential of what sociologist Yves Spangler calls the more Mao than thou trend in many leftist circles, because progressives see themselves as challenging power and oppressive forces that can become self-righteous to some degree and thus think that they have a monopoly on truth and morality. And it's precisely this kind of, although his book appeared in 2020 and after Erez and I published the article Israel as a Homotopia in Language and Society. It's a bit what we are trying to do in that article, namely we are trying to say that we should be careful, like some scholars of homonationalism have done, to just issue this verdict of guilty against some queer Palestinians. Instead, perhaps we should, we should try to capture the complexities in which queer Palestinians, especially queer Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, find themselves in, and what kind of negotiations of belonging they do all the time. And then I am a bit angry about research on multilingualism, because research on multilingualism has produced an immense body of work talking about ethnicity, more recently race, social class, and all possible factors that play an important role in the lived experiences of multilingual speakers. But sexuality is never really engaged with properly. The exception, I mean, of course, there are always exceptions. The exception is Holly Cashman's fantastic book, Queer, Latinx, and Bilinguals. So, I mean, how do I channel all this anger analytically? Because one should try to channel emotions towards things that become then hopefully productive. So my main channeling, not just in these two articles, but I would say in all my work, is to look at incoherences, ambivalences, double binds. I mean, I remember, and now I'm not going to say any name, and it's someone who is not here attending this this webinar, that a lot of my work has been influenced by an experience I had when I was, I think I just finished my PhD in 2007, and I went to ILA in Essen. And I went to a panel, no names mentioned, and there was this very important scholar who at the end of this panel was giving a commentary on the panel, and the person said, oh, what strikes me that brings together all the papers in this panel is coherence, the coherence of narratives. And I was thinking, there was nothing coherent about all these, what these people were saying, not only what the papers were saying, but also, most importantly, there's no coherence in the actual data. And coherence was something that was superimposed by a scholar to try and find what they wanted to find. For me, the most important aspect of my work is to show how human beings are deeply incoherent, even in one and the same sentence. And it's okay, because we are constantly juggling between very different opposing ideologies that take us towards different directions. I would say, to use a metaphor, that we human beings always are in the midst of a magnetic field of forces that push and pull us towards different directions at the same time. And if I am successful in doing that as an analyst, it's precisely showing those ambivalences, double binds, and incoherencies. So, and I find that Foucault's notion of heterotopia and heterochrony particularly appealing to capture those incoherences, those double binds, those ambivalences. And here I'm just going to quote, the quote is also in the article, Israel's homotopia. Heterotopias are real places that do exist and that are formed in the very founding of society, which is something like countersides, a kind of effectively inactive utopia, in which the real sides, all the other real sides that can be found within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Places of this kind are outside of all places, even though it may be possible to indicate their location in reality. Because these places are absolutely different from all the sides that they reflect and speak about, I shall call them, by way of contrast to utopias, heterotopias. And then Foucault says, which is again, I think is very powerful, powerful image, everyone can enter into heterotopic size, but in truth, it is only an illusion. We think we enter, and yet we are, by the very fact of having entered, excluded. And this is, to us, to Erez and to me, the crux of the matter for the queer Palestinians who are part of this documentary oriented, which we analyze in the article Israel's Homotopia, because in a sense, they get attracted to Israel, they get pulled into Israel, they get Israel is a magnetic field of force that attracts them. But as soon as they enter it in this space, they get, by the fact of having it, excluded. And that's what we call vicious belonging. So being attracted to something that ultimately is gonna exclude you and kick you out. And just to conclude, I think that part of the anger and part of the complexities that I try to capture in my analysis about other people as also the complexities, the double binds in which I find myself in as a human being, which I think can be captured through Michael Rothberg, very recent book, The Implicated Subject, where he suggests the notion of implicated subject as a way to complexify two simplistic distinctions between victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, and captures the fact that most of us feel torn by our relation to divergent, intersecting histories, in this case, history of anti-Semitism, genocide, and occupation. The category of the implicated subject allows us to retain our sense of situations of conflict, position us in morally and emotionally complex ways. And I have to say that I am morally and emotionally caught in very complex ways with regard to Israel-Palestine, where on the one hand, I strongly recognize the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign state. At the same time, I also strongly support the movement for Palestinian justice. And I'm gonna close on this.
Raphael, do you have a couple of questions for Tommaso, or do you want me to jump in now?
You can jump in, Makone. Yes.
Yeah. Tommaso, thank you very much. I've enjoyed your presentation and I've enjoyed reading your work over the years. But I have a couple of questions, and some of my questions arise from reading your work and from listening to Busi talk about your work. So there won't be anything completely original in the questions that I pose. But I can assure you I didn't share my questions with her before this. So let's focus on the issue of queer multilingualism. I want to focus on the issue about queerness. Are you framing queerness in this case as a universal representation of sexuality, or are you saying that queerness is a reduction of the world to a representation? Which direction are you taking there? Is it a universal representation of sexuality, or a reduction of the world to a representation?
No, I see queerness as a very complex subject position that cannot be necessarily captured by the categories gay, lesbian,
Yes.
and so on and so on, but it's more an in many ways, an anti-categorical way of seeing oneself and one's own sexuality. I'm not saying in any ways that people should not use gay and lesbian. I mean, people can use whichever categories they want. It's just that queering, both as an academic practice and as an activist practice, is always trying to show and argue for the complexity of identities, and also the double binds of identities, and the fact that identities always bring with them, like it become like straight jackets, right? And so we need to see the limit of what identity can bring to us, both as an analyst and as activists.
So if that is the case, if queerness is a multi-layered, ambivalent category, etc., etc., my question then is this: within the world of queer, lesbian scholarship, what are the debates that occur within it, right? What are the tensions, what are the fault lines within that particular universe of scholarship or of activism?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and I could speak for days about the debates in queer scholarship. Just to keep them very short, the most recent ones are about the whiteness of queerness, because we know queer scholarship has been produced in the Northern Hemispheres. It developed in a lot of, and established itself in the Northern Hemisphere, although there is, of course, a burgeoning queer scholarship in the south of the world, in Brazil, in South Africa, in other parts of the world. And one of the big critiques that have been moved both from Africa and from Brazil and from South America is precisely about how queer scholars in the North relate to, engage with, or better, do not engage with scholarship in the south of the world. So this is a big topic in queer scholarship, both in the so-called queer studies or gender and women's studies departments, but also within the field of language and sexuality. So, for example, scholars like Rodrigo Borba in Brazil, Branca Falabella Fabrizio, Thabo Msebens in South Africa have moved kind of southern critique of queer work on language. So I would say this is to me the main debate. The other debate, of course, which emerged as a result of special issue published by Robin Wigman in the feminist journal Differences, is about normativity, or better, the normative anti-normativity of queer theory. So they would say that queer theory and queer theoretical scholarship has kind of nurtured this anti-normative attitude that has become its own normative engine of that underpins queer scholarship. And it's an interesting debate. And of course, we can discuss more about what queer theory would look like if we took normativity, or better, if we took anti-normativity out of it. Yeah, it's being debated as we speak.
Okay, right. Let me then continue the conversation. I'll ask one or two more questions, then I'll give up to Raphael to open up the conversation. I I agree with you that there is a sense in which queer scholarship is methodologically white, in the sense that the limited literature I've read on the topic seems to give me the impression that it sets up white experience as a universal category, and everybody else's experience is, to some extent, identity politics, right? Mm-hmm. So from a Southern perspective, I would prefer the whole situation to be the opposite, right? In a sense, to explore how Southern experiences can become the norm against which white queer scholarship or white queer sexual practices are assessed, to turn the world completely upside down, so to speak. That's, I mean, one way in which I would be interested in pursuing. That leads me to the second issue, if I were to borrow, I think, the terms by Bonaventura dos Santos. The question becomes, from your perspective, what are the sociological absences? What are the topics that are not raised currently in queer scholarship, around queer scholarship? In other words, if you were to use the notion of sociology of absences, what is absent at the moment from that world of queer scholarship? Yeah,
yeah, it's a tough one. Talking about what's absent is always a bit difficult. I think what's absent, I mean, I guess it's present. It's just, it's present in specific niched field. I would want to see more work coming from the south of the world, by scholars who are from the south of the world and who are based in the south of the world, really speaking back to queer theory and telling us how things do not work in the specific context. I mean, in the specific context that they're analyzing. So say how we can speak back to queer theory in a way that we can contribute to a more complex, more nuanced theory production from the South. And in a certain way, I mean, it is being pursued. I mean, people like Thabo Msibi, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and others have started this work, or colleagues from Brazil have started this work. It's just that it doesn't, interestingly, I'm not sure whether it's because of the publishing, the geopolitics of publishing, that they did not appear in more mainstream big journals. That's why, in Language and Society, Susan Ehrlich and I welcome more scholarship from the South. I mean, not to say that people should not publish in small local journals. Absolutely. It's just saying that, however, I would want to see more influence from the South on the big debates and on the big journals that are read by a lot of people.
Okay. Then my last question is, given the way in which you do work both in queer scholarship and activism, how do you seek to build into your work 3 dimensions: issues about resistance, disruption, and disobedience? If one were to borrow from Walter Mignolo, how do you build that into your work and as an individual scholar, your professional responsibilities? In other words, you in your totality, how do you build into yourself these 3 different dimensions: the resistance, disruption, and disobedience?
Yeah, excellent, really excellent point. I think have been influenced over the last years by Luis Paulo da Mota Lopes, let's say, notion of undisciplined applied linguistics.
Yes.
I think I am undisciplined. I'm always very undisciplined. I think I'm a very contrarian person. I try to go against the grain wherever I can, never conform, both in terms of how I write, my style, what I write. And of course, I also have to say that sometimes I can do what I do, I can write what I write, well, because of the privilege I carry with me, because of the fact that I am a full professor, that I am established, and so I do not, although I certainly want to encourage more junior scholars to also be disobedient, to always be disobedient, but I also have to acknowledge that I can be disobedient. I am allowed to be disobedient also because of the structural power I have, and it's horrible to say, but yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah. Rafael, I'm done. Thanks a lot. We can continue the conversation later on, but let me open up to other people.
Thank you for initiating the conversation, Makoni. And so far, 2 people have written in the chat box saying that they wanted to either ask questions or make comments. And the first one is Brett Diaz.
Hey, so I really enjoyed your the readings quite a lot, and it was really refreshing for me to see work sort of, as you put it, on more queer and I sort of lumped them in a sense, but queer and sexual identities that go across different spaces and different areas, especially for multilingualism, not just as a thing that people do, but as a way they form who they are and express themselves. And so one of the questions I had, and also, so my background, I especially focus on affect and emotion in my work. So that was also very refreshing also because the turn to affect has been quite interesting to me over time. Not quite sure how I feel about it overall, but here I am, so whatever. So when I was reading the 2 works, I had a specific question, which was about if you could really expand a little more on how you use and understand emotion or affect, depending on how you want to use it at the time. How you understand it in your work, especially as a discourse analyst, because I find like I can see the thread with like Sarah Ahmed's work in your work, but one of the problems I tend to have with that more cultural or critical theory approach to it is that I miss some of the substance. I miss some of the how it's done or what is being done in that way. And I think from a critique of that would be a lot of the times I find that those constructions of emotion tend to be very weird, capital weird, Western, educated, industrial, those sorts of conceptions of emotion, which can erase a lot of the nuance and a lot of what the practice is trying to accomplish, or potentially trying to accomplish, I should say. And so I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit. And as an addendum to that, as you were talking, I really appreciated your mentioning the incoherence. Because a lot of work in stance that takes on affective stance sees it as very unidirectional and very static. And I patently disagree with that. And my work has focused right now on using discourse analytic structures to find incoherence. So like finding ways in which people, as you say, conflict with themselves and are incoherent with their own statements, even minute to minute, even though the subject hasn't changed. Sort of like you showed with like Louis, for example, using these different affective positions as he's talking about the same thing, sometimes in the same language, but his identity shifts at times, and the affect is one of the fluid parts of that. And so, yeah, I just would really appreciate if you could expand on that a little bit, maybe concretize it a little bit for me in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for reading my work so thoroughly. Yes, so I have to say, I also want to add that I identify as a critical discourse analyst. So another anger I've had over the years against critical discourse analysis has been precisely to the focus that critical discourse analysis has on this kind of Habermasian idea of the public sphere and deliberative debate. So which focusing very much on, okay, the way in which people kind of try to convince each other, in a democratic society. And often, like, I mean, I was at a conference and a couple of years ago where Norman Fairclough gave a talk, and he still said, that argumentation is the locus of CDA analysis. And my plenary there was like, no. It's affect. We cannot understand politics without affect, right? So I've tried to then add an affective element to CDA, and I do find the work by Sarah Ahmed particularly relevant. However, I agree with you that it's for discourse analysts, it's sometimes difficult to operationalize Sarah Ahmed's theories. So I found a lot of help with the work of Margaret Wetherell, who is a discursive psychologist, and although I do not identify as a discursive psychologist, she really gives a very clear way about how to operationalize Ahmed to different forms of discourse analysis, including multimodal discourse analysis. So for me, I mean, affect, because, and I have a special issue of social semiotics together with John Richardson that is coming out next year, all on discourse and affect, and where different contributors then operationalize affect very differently to discourse analysis and semiotic analysis. But I would say that for me, it's always a matter of trying to ask oneself the question, what lies beside identity? So, which is what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick said many years ago. Like, too much focus on identity does not make us see what lies beside it. And what lies beside is, in this specific case, affect, and kind of glues together the interactions. So, I mean, analytically, of course, I'm sure that you want to know how I go about it. It's tricky. It's tricky because, I mean, it's not just a matter of finding words or verbs or nouns that are affective, because ultimately any word can be actually affective. It's just to understand the affective loading in that specific context. And because I'm not a conversation analyst, but then ultimately a critical discourse analyst, it's always about trying to bring your ethnographic knowledge about the context, about the political situation, about the specific loading that certain words have in that specific context. And I mean, and I have to add, that in the case of Israel-Palestine, I always co-write with people who are either Hebrew or Arabic speakers, and who have lived or live in Israel, Palestine. So it's always a teamwork in the analysis.
So if I could just add one thing to that, I really appreciate you mentioning Margaret Wetherell. That was actually going to be my question on that particular line, was if you had looked at her work. And one of the things I found really fruitful about taking her effective practices approach to it is the use of what's currently called the constructed theory of emotion, and this way of seeing emotion as this experience of different forms of like raw affect or whatever that combine and create complex emotional expressions, but it's always situated and put into a particular context with particular speakers, with particular actions, like sort of on order. And so in my work, the thing that I've done most recently is trying to find how you can locate those different incoherences that you mentioned, that thing called like connotative inversion, because you find, you might present yourself as like Louis does, as Palestinian, but also is pushing against that as saying, no, I'm Israeli, I was born, I have this card, that card. And what you find is that particular example, the card or the being or the whatever, are charged along affective dimensions. As opposed, as you said, and I agree completely, you will not usually find someone say, I am angry about this because I feel that I am X or Y or Z. You find them using their phonetics, their sociophonetics, using their discourse. And that's where I find these evaluative elements come in. And so I wondered if you had thought about that as a way of disentangling, as you said, the identity from the expression itself, because from my perspective, as you said, the affect is the fluid on which the identity rides. You know, you don't find someone say, this is who I am, blah, 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 blah. It's expressed along these, and as it becomes charged semiotically through the affect. And so I didn't know if you had anything to say about that, or some specific examples you might have come across that you could, I guess, find a way to operationalize in a concrete way. And then I'll get off of this high horse and let other people.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I think, as you say, you know, there are specific markers, you know, that are, in this specific case, I guess what you look at is language, but the markers could also be visual. You know, the markers could be other things. The marker could be gestural. The markers could be the use of a specific color. You know, if we look at the domain of representation, or the domain of interaction. So, as you say, exactly, there are always some small markers, and those markers are always very small. They're never like the big kind of they're never there unless they're just glaring at you unless you're looking for them, right? And that's why a lot of research is focused on identity. I'm not saying, I mean, I've contributed immensely to the work on identity, and I'm saying that we should definitely continue working on identity, but I'm saying that a lot of work that is focused exclusively on identity has sometimes missed that there were other things alongside identity that, however, really made those identities quite salient in particular ways. You know?
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Tommaso Milani, who'd like to make a comment on rage and injustice in scholarship.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've been distracted by the chat. So like, yeah, I'm not very good at handling like screens and lots of people.
No, that's
can
fine.
you repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. I was just calling Tommaso Milani, who had a comment on rage and injustice in scholarship.
Okay, what I wanted to say was I do identify, sort of understand Tommaso when he expresses this idea of queer rage. But because at the same time, as a Black woman in scholarship, an African, I also am experiencing a lot of rage. While I cannot call that queer rage, I also experience injustice, particularly the injustice towards Black women in scholarship, where our work is not even published. Well, it has already been mentioned about the idea of, you know, the geopolitics of publication. Even when we publish, we are rarely ever cited. We are rarely ever even called upon to be in editorial boards in journals. We are not visible in serious scholarship, to the extent that we feel as if we are completely erased in scholarship, even if in terms of our bodies, we are present. So that in its own leads to a lot of rage. I, to some extent, feel that, you know, Tommaso is in a better position because he can at least use his position of white privilege to exercise that disobedience, even express that rage. If I, as a Black woman, express any form of rage, then I will be dubbed an aggressive, angry Black woman and fall into the stereotype of the sapphire. So in order to avoid the stereotype of the sapphire, I have to walk a very fine line, a very thin, fine line to keep myself in check. And in keeping myself in check, I am falling into the trap of what Audre Lorde defines as, you know, being, keeping silent which she also says, you know, keeping in silent will not help you, because keeping in silent makes you also complicit with the system that is actually discriminating against you. I have had moments to think very deeply about this issue because, like I said, I also am experiencing that element of rage. And during this period of lockdown, I really had a lot of time to think about a lot of things. And it also didn't help to experience, you know, George Floyd being murdered right in, you know, in the glaring of the international media. We saw it over and over played in our eyes. During that time, I also read the book Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. And one of the things that I found out, which I had never really thought about seriously, was that in colonial times, the idea or the category of Black woman did not actually seriously exist as a category. There is actually a book about if all the women are white and all the Blacks are male, then Black woman as a category does not exist. So our invisibility seems, at least in my view, to foreground that aspect that we have actually even in colonial times have been a sort of a sidebar, a non-existent category at all. So if that be the case, then it sort of makes the question, some of you who might have read the work, well, something about Sojourner Truth, the history of Sojourner Truth, the question that she poses where she says, ain't I a woman too? Very poignant for us Black women, because that question arises. There's a lot written in scholarship about sexism. The sexism that is being written about is about white women being excluded in scholarship. But the real women that are being erased are Black women. But because Black women as a category do not exist, that is silent. That's never even raised. That's not even an issue because we don't exist. So that raises that rage in me, that driving rage. So the question to my good old friend, Tommaso, is how do I, as a Black woman, ever express this rage, this anger, and become disobedient without falling into the stereotype of being a sufferer?
I am, I honestly, it's a, I actually have to say, I don't have words because I am quite, I'm overwhelmed by what you said because I am completely understand. And that's why what you're saying, and it makes me even angry. And that's why I said what I said, that a lot of the disobedience that I can perform is allowed because of my being white, male, cisgendered, and middle class. And I think it would be out of place of me as a white man to tell a Black female academic about what to do. I somehow, I do believe that I understand what it means for you to fall into the category of the disobedient Black woman, you know, and what would that mean? But at the same time, I believe actually in that we need to forge more solidarities among angry academics, whether it's queer anger, whether it's Black anger. I think we just need to, and especially for those of us who find ourselves in a position of power, me in particular, also being the editor of a big journal, to create the space for this solidarity to take shape. So my point, I'm not sure whether it's gonna help or not, is that we need to talk more, and we need to link our academic activisms together. We might have different perspectives, and we might want to have different foci, but I think that we have so much more in common about fighting injustices that therefore we should not be split, but we actually should forge more global solidarities, North, South, queer, Black, and so on, because that's the only way we can actually both push our disciplines forward, but also fight these horrible times of Trump and the return of the Nazis in Sweden. I am sorry, like, you know, we can only fight if we are in solidarity with each other and with a common goal, fighting against injustices, both in the academic world and out there. But also, most important, we have to remember that there is a huge return of positivism. So my work is constantly being questioned from specific parts of multilingualism research or for specific parts of the humanities that say practically that my work is just some form of glorified journalism because I do not measure things. So there's also that fight that we have to carry, and that's, you know, the fight against for the legitimacy of queer activist inquiry.
Okay, I've been in communication, thank you, and I've been in communication with my colleague Magda, and we feel that we can bridge a bit the order of the questions to ask for Cristina Severo to perhaps make a comment about a comment that she wrote in the chat box in relation to the mixes between activism and scholarship in Southern context, or more specifically in Brazil, because we feel that this connects very well to what has just been talked about now. Cristina, would you be willing to talk about this?
Oh, actually, that was just a comment. It was just a comment on how Southern contexts have been producing a lot in Portuguese and Spanish, even scholarship in terms of activism. And one example is this seminar, international seminar called Fazendo Gênero, Doing Gender, that, I mean, it attracts people from all parts of the world, so just a comment. And I agree that the main issue is related to the politics of publication and dissemination. Yes. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Cristina. Actually, Fazendo Gênero is a fantastic conference. I know it. Unfortunately, I've never been able to attend it, but but my good friend Carmen Caldas Coulthard, was part of the organization of when it was at University of Santa Catarina in Florianopolis. And I think that, a lot of the inspiration I get is precisely from scholars in the global South, or from scholars who produce about the work about the global South. Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. And then next up we have Hilary Jenks, who wrote in the chat. Can Tommaso speak more about queer multilingualism specifically, as say opposed to queer linguistics?
Yeah, it's not so much that it's opposed, it's just that queer linguistics, which is a fantastic body of scholarship on language and sexuality, has been kind of historically been quite monolingual, right? So it's very much focusing on, there are always exceptions, and there is, the big exception is Holly Cashman's monograph on queer Latinx and bilinguals in Phoenix, Arizona, But yes, so I would love work on language and sexuality that takes a queer perspective to engage more with multilingual data, because it feels like that they haven't really engaged enough. So I would say then queering multilingualism is part of queer linguistics, but bringing more multilingual perspective to it.
Thank you. And there is a comment by Marika, or a question that I wonder if Marika would like to expand on it a bit, because it's written angry plus gay versus angry plus lesbian. Is that a question that you'd like to develop, Marika? Or?
Well, it was a thought that I was typing while I was listening,
yeah.
In terms of what was already said and what Tommaso, you said in the beginning about being angry. And then I'm sitting here and I'm wondering again, if I were to identify as a lesbian, which I do, then to me, again, being angry is much different from being angry for a gay man. So it was kind of an undeveloped thought that I just wrote down to see if maybe anyone wanted to take that up and discuss it from that point of view.
Absolutely. And as I said, I mean, I really hope to have, to have emphasized, that it's easier for me to be angry and queer man than angry plus other identity categories, right? So again, which means that then even if queer scholarship hasn't often engaged with the notion of intersectionality, I mean, I've been one of those who argues that there's so much to gain from bringing queer scholarship in a dialogue with intersectionality scholarship, because on the one side, intersectionality scholarship has often said that I've often seen queer scholarship as threatening because queer scholarship questions identity categories, but that doesn't necessarily need to be like that, because queer scholarship has also said that identity categories can be used and should be used as long as we are aware of the limitations of identity categories. And then, of course, queer scholarship hasn't really considered intersectionality, I guess, because the focus has always been, we start from sexuality rather than from race, But I believe that that's also a bit of a, that we could get over like that impasse, because the question is not so much whether it's first sexuality then race, it's first race then sexuality, but we need to try and understand how these patterns of oppression kind of intersect with each other, right? And therefore I do believe that queer theory and intersectionality can be brought into a very productive dialogue, and actually should be brought into productive dialogue if we want to move on,
Thank you. Just so I present now an overview of the people who still want to ask questions or make comments, I have here on the list Ashraf, then Christopher, Sangeeta, and Ofele Garcia. So Ashraf, you have a question or a couple of questions about queerness and revolutions in the Arab world?
Yes, thank you so much. I first need to thank Tommaso for the presentation, which I learned a lot from it. I need to put my question straight away because we need Libad an answer for that, or at least a direction. The relationship between people with queer orientation and the protesting or revolutions in the Arab world. You know that since the end of 2010, there have been a series of revolutions in the Arab world. So have you thought about the position or the contribution of those let me say, the people who have anti-normative attitude, and particularly the complexities, the contradictions. People there are fighting for establishing a democratic system on using the traditional framework of the nation state, which is very exclusionary of people with abnormal, using the language of the system, abnormal sexual orientations. So how can we deal with that contradiction? We need to build the state, so we can allow you to have a voice. Without, we have to play the system. We have to play the game. See what I mean? So how do you react to this point? And I from the way you talked, actually the automaticity of your performance gave me the sense that talking about sexuality is a very seriously situated business, because In the Arab world, for example, if you talk about sexuality in the way you do, it becomes a matter of life and death. Serious business. So for this reason, the interpretation that this discourse which you use is a wide discourse is rationalized, you can say, from the perspective of those people. You see what I mean? I also, the second question, or this is the final question I have, actually, because we have a book on the social linguistics of protesting, these issues actually concern us. The vocabularies, now we have used the vocabulary to talk about, have you thought about the vocabularies? I think this question was touched on by Busi and Simfrey, about the vocabularies, non-Western vocabularies to talk about sexuality or sexual relationships. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I mean, I don't think I can talk about the Arab world in its entirety, and it's always difficult for me to talk about the ratio between sexuality and the politics of nationalism in the Arab world. And I do understand the double binds that you are emphasizing. I just want to refer you to the work of a very important activist, Palestinian activist collective called Al-Qaus, so the rainbow, and especially the work by Haneen Maiki, who is the director of Al-Qaus. And Haneen has both written extensively and spoken extensively about the double binds of Palestinian queer resistance within the context of establishing a Palestinian state. So I do not want to answer your question, not because I can't answer the question, but because I think that other people should answer that question, namely Haneen Mahi should answer that question. And I can, if you want, I can send you all the links to her publications, her statements and her YouTube videos. So I think you will find a compelling argument from her about how queer movements can be part of broader struggles for the establishment of an independent and democratic nation state. When it comes to vocabularies, yes, definitely, perhaps, but not necessarily in the context, I mean, vocabularies that are not Western vocabularies, yes, definitely. In my work on Brazil, together with Rodrigo Borba, in my work on South Africa, with South African scholars, local vocabularies have always been an important component where I was trying to capture things that could not be captured with concepts that are being created in Northern or Western concepts, yes.
Thank you. We have 3 more people who have signalized that they want to ask questions. And I was wondering if Christopher and Sangeeta would be so kind to let Ophelia make her comment before she leaves, because she had mentioned that she has to leave in, what, 3 minutes? And if you're planning to stay until then, Sangeeta and Christopher, yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I was just writing something in the chat, and I'm going to send it even though it's not coherent, because I didn't think I was going to have a chance to see all of you. First of all, Tommaso, it's good to see you again.
Likewise.
And, you know, I have felt very uncomfortable about our reaction collectively to Busi's rage, because I think that there's so much going on these days, and I felt Busi's pain, and somehow I don't think we grappled with it. So, you know, that is my main concern, that every time that a Black woman raises this rage, that they absolutely need to express, and that takes so much courage to be able to say it. Because we all know Busi's work, we know how powerful it is, and yet how silent she has been. And she has now really taken on this voice. And I thought we needed to be mindful of that. And then I wanted to just say that I think that Tommaso's approach to talking about queering the ing part of it, I think has to remind all of us that we all have different bodies and our emotions are embodied in us, and that the way in which we perform and the way in which others see us makes our experiences different. So I think that, you know, queering is also something that is felt differently by a lesbian, by a white person, by a Black woman. And I think we have to be mindful of that. So
Absolutely.
thank you, Tommaso, for
thank you, Ophelia.
making me think about these things. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher and Sangeeta. Christopher, you have a comment now, right?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, the moderator. Thank you, Tommaso, for this work. It's a pleasure meeting you. Virtually. I was wondering whether you really thought about the prospect of queer scholarship outside the typical Western environment, to include, say, a typical African context. Why I'm saying this is that some time ago in 2015, when we had our presidential election, it was a contest between former President Goodluck Jonathan, and now the current President Muhammadu Buhari. There was this pressure coming from the then President of America, Barack Obama, requesting the government in power then to legalize gay marriage, you know, and then the then president didn't find it funny, and he told Barack Obama in plain language that gay marriage is un-African, and they cannot even think about that. And there's this conspiracy theory that because of that, American government that time decided to, you know, support Buhari, and then by that, Jonathan, in fact, that was the major reason people were saying that was why Jonathan lost the election to his rival, that is Muhammadu Buhari. So I was wondering, what do you think will be against the background, do you think there's any prospect for queer scholarship in a typical African setting? Because it was a kind of, that's a typical example of queer rage and injustice within the African context. I don't know your view about this. Thank you.
I wonder whether I understand your question correctly. I mean, there is a lot of queer scholarship in African contexts. I mean, in Uganda, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana. I mean, there is a lot of queer scholarship. There's a lot of queer rage in African contexts, and there are lots of queer activism in African contexts. And it's just that it's perhaps not seen or read enough in many parts of the world, unfortunately. And then there's a lot of very problematic discourses that also circulate among Northern academics. I mean, I remember when IGALA, when the IGALA board, the International General Language Association, discussed the proposal of having IGALA in Gaborone in Botswana. And again, the reaction of some otherwise very progressive scholars against having the conference in Gaborone because they were afraid homophobic attacks against the participants. And some of us had to say, you know, there's a very well-developed queer scholarship at the University of Botswana. There's a very well-developed queer activism in Botswana. Nothing is going to happen. And then the conference did happen in Botswana. And the Vice Chancellor gave perhaps what I felt was the most touching speech I've ever heard. A Vice Chancellor, you know, Vice Chancellors always open conference. I think they're always like extremely boring, right? You know, it's always like about like how successful the university is or how amazing the university is and so on and so on. You know, it's their job, right? You know, but the Vice Chancellor actually not only had read what the conference was about, namely gender and language, which was also sexuality, although it's called gender language, it also has to do with sexuality. Also gave a fantastic speech about transgender lived experiences and rights and the importance of transgender lives in Botswana. I mean, we were all kind of nearly in tears. The Vice Chancellor had prepared such a beautifully crafted, powerful speech. And I guess that a lot of, I mean, at that time I was living in South Africa. So, I mean, I was very happy that the Vice Chancellor gave such a speech, but I can say that a lot of the delegates perhaps were slightly surprised, you know, that the Vice Chancellor from an African university gave such a speech. And I was quite pleased then that they actually realized that all the reservations against having Igala in Botswana were actually unfounded, because it was a fantastic conference and in a very, very welcoming and very productive environment with regard to gender and sexuality.
Thank you.
Thank you. And last comment then by Sangeeta.
Thank you, Tommaso. You bring such a fresh breath of air to disobedience. And I have one question and a couple of comments. And the question is, of course, it shouldn't sound rhetorically, but given that we are in Sweden, can one be complacent and not be angry as a scholar? So that is my question, and I mean it seriously. And of course, it is the shared Swedish space that I draw upon. So my comments are related to where the field of Southern theory or Southern theories in the plural are going. I sometimes get to feel when in your responses that there is this staticness of who is and where one can position a researcher. I'm sorry, am I the only one who's getting this feedback?
The echo.
Yeah, okay. So instead of someone being in the north or bringing scholars from the south, given our contemporary lives, don't we need to look at gaze, which is mobile? So I'm reflecting a lot about these issues of the mobile gaze in much of my writing, and I think I just wanted to throw that out. And then Sweden is a periphery in the global north, and I think that is one way in which I grapple with this obedience that all white Swedish scholars seem to have. And in that sense, you do, when you came back from South Africa to Sweden, you brought this breadth of freshness with you. So on social media, I mean, we become allies because we see that things are so quiet. And then I think this needs to be also recognized, that spaces like Sweden are very, very complacent. I was in lockdown during the pandemic and couldn't get myself back home. And so from a distance, I could see what was happening with Black Lives Matter all over the globe. but nothing was happening in Sweden. So I mean, that is just one way of understanding this. And I completely agree with you that having a position of a senior scholar in a place like Sweden allows us to do certain things. But it also is a very, very precarious situation, because you get immediately branded. And perhaps being foolhardy. I remember getting my chair when I was just 44. And I was not aware of the foolhardiness that was required. And so it was good to get branded very young, because then, you know, you have no other place to go to. But I'd like you to reflect on this complacency. Can research, whether it is in queer, the area of queer studies, or functionality, or other areas of marginalization, can we not be enraged?
Thank you, Sangeeta, who is my ally on social media and elsewhere, you know, and in the academic world, you know, especially in Sweden, you know. Yes, Sweden is I mean, for those of you who are listening from all over the world, if you believe that Sweden is a paradise, then you're wrong. You know, it's good in many ways, and it's a good place in many ways, but it's a very complex place insofar as there's a lot of falling on the line. So everyone is there's a lot of alignment, you know, and people like me who are not aligned or try not to be aligned, you know, we get marked as the troublemakers, you know, and it's okay, you know, it's okay. Before I answer your question, I really want to kind of address a point you're making that is very important, you know, the gaze. And I wasn't in any way trying to reproduce in like too facile distinction between like scholars in the South, scholar in the North. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize the importance of scholars who are from the South and who still live in the South and work in the South, compared to, say, Mignolo and others who are from the South and I thoroughly respect, but who are in the North and can reap other types of institutional privileges that, say, a scholar at university in say the rural university in South Africa, or university in other places, or university in Brazil, don't really reap, right? So I totally agree with your points on it's important to look at gaze. It's a way of seeing, it's a way of analyzing the world. At the same time, I am a bit, I'm at times a bit unsettled by the fact that a lot of the discussions on Southern theories and Southern multilingualism are being carried further by white scholars from the North, based in the North, or, you know, white scholars in the South. But, you know, what I'm trying to say is that we need to negotiate our positionalities, right? And I'm not here to cast any judgment of guilty or such. I'm just saying that we need, whatever we do, it's important to have a different gaze, right? But we cannot possibly write about Southern theories or Southern multilingualism or Southern perspective without actually engaging with our own positionality and with other positionalities, right? So I totally, completely agree with you, Sangeeta. So I certainly do not want to place people in too easy boxes, but I still, as I said, I still want to underline and emphasize the importance of the work done by Southern scholars from the South and who stay in the South and work in the South, because their work is many times under very different conditions from the work that we do in terms of structural support that we have in the North, right? And of course, there is then the South in the North in the South, and so on and so on and so on. And we go. When it comes to complacency, yes. I mean, and Sweden is it's a place where one can become easily complacent for two reasons. We have lots of money, right? We have lots of support. There are lots of grants. There are lots of possibilities, and also there is huge forces within the Swedish academic world that want us to actually get aligned and not to be disobedient, right? And I feel it every day. I can see it. People, when I sit at meetings, say, you know, oh, we are here. I sit on a lot of committees, as often is the case. And then I look myself around the table as like I'm the only non-Swede at the table, right? And I say like, oh, not only I'm the only non-Swede, but also there's only one woman. I was like, oh, good grief, like in Sweden, which should be like the most gender equal society in the world. Like we sit on in a committee meeting, and like the committee is only consists of men plus one woman. Like, and I say, I think there's something, and I say very openly, I said it very openly the first time I was part of a committee, I think there's something wrong here. You know, like where are the women? Like where are the people of color? Like, you know, and then people start rolling their eyes like, oh, I can see how people like start cringing, they move in the chair, they look down because Swedes, you know, I mean, I don't want to essentialize, they're non-confrontative. And it's like, oh my word, like, did I just say something wrong? Like, you know, I mean, then I said, okay, let's not look at race now. Let's just start from gender. Like, you know, how is it possible that we have committees where men still dominate the scene, right? Like, this is Sweden. But, you know, I mean, I don't think I will ever be complacent. If I become complacent, Sangeeta, you have to tell me that I become complacent, because at that point, like there's something wrong with me right now, and someone must have just injected something in me in Sweden. But yes, one can be complacent, but I hope I will never be.
Thank you. I've lost the thread, but yes, I quite agree with you. Your comment on the mobility issue is very right. My point was just that instead of North-South, we need to talk about mobility as kind of making it much more complex than it is in contemporary times, because this boxing in then creates other kinds of issues. So there can be double and triple marginalizations.
Absolutely.
Because, yeah, so thank you.
Thanks everyone who's asked questions, made comments, and enriched our discussion. And Makoni, would you like to bring together some of the topics that have been discussed before we can finish?
Okay, let me try and do that and move the discussion further. I understand the issue of North, South, etc., and the dynamics about positionalities. I think the key issue here is the importance of self-reflexivity about where one is, and in terms of the epistemological orientations and political positions that they may take. But I think we need not only North-South or South-South, we need a much more global view that also includes post-Soviet republics, because there's a tendency to exclude scholarship from the former post-Soviet republics in any discussions about North-South, right? But if you include that particular geographical region, I think we will have a much richer understanding of whatever South or Northern scholarship is all about, because the post-Soviet republics bring with them certain challenges about being on the periphery, but not being on too much of the periphery, so something like semi-periphery. So that I think is an important issue to consider. Then I think the general discussion left me with the impression that issues like sexuality and queerness are to some extent ambiguous and ambivalent terms. And the form that they eventually may take may depend very much on the bodies through which they are enacted. which means in some contexts you might need to link up sexuality with patriarchy or sexuality with matriarchy, etc., in order to understand what is taking place there. Then there was, I think, a very important discussion that took place about affect and all that. My own response is that in as much as I am sympathetic towards that scholarship, it is important to bear in mind that the categories like affect, cognition, attitudes, etc., are not natural categories. They are categories that are an artifact of particular analytical ways of thinking about them. And I think Kate Datzinger put it very neatly, that the tendency is to think the categories that which one uses are the natural categories, and the categories which everybody else uses are not natural categories. So if there is anything valuable about Southern scholarship, is that it should lead Northern scholarship to question some of the basis of their assumptions. For example, is affect a category that is different from cognition, or is affect a product of a Western mind thinking about the world in particular ways? Then I think the most important part that which we need to think about as we go along is the statement that was being made about the nature of what disobedient scholarship means. And ultimately, I think the extent to which you're going to be disobedient, or the form that your disobedience will take, may depend very much on the stage where you are in terms of your own career trajectory and what are the options that are left open to you. Having said that, now I'm going to give over to Ashraf and Christine, whom are going to talk briefly about the book that we are putting together called The Sociolinguistics of Protest, which they will give us an idea about how far they've gone with that. Christine or Ashraf, who is taking over?
Yeah. Thank you. Christine, can you where's Christine? Okay, let me try.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, very briefly, it's the intention here is to give just an update about this project, social linguistic testing. Yes, that's the name of the project, social linguistic testing. And yes, thank you. The main idea is that, we need to understand how the different forms of testing are social semiotically organized, narrated, and reflected on in different contexts, and also through the nature of the vocabularies or the meta languages which are used in those contexts. And can you go also to the second slide? Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, these are different issues. You see that growing actually. We're adding more issues. We added, for example, the narratives and testing to understand the forms of protest against colonialism, for example, and against slavery. These forms of writing. Also, we have added the issue of students' protests out of school. Political protests led by students, organized by students in the West or in the global South, in the different contexts. And here we have actually tried to, as possible as we can, to produce a list, to invite contributions to talk about different aspects of the protesting in those contexts, like racism, the purpose of racism, gender, and agency, how agency is imagined, how agency is generated, constructed, or worked on in those protesting contexts, and also the symbolic landscaping and protesting. Translanguaging, yes, it's a category of analysis, but it helps us also understand the complexity of linguistic practice in those contexts, and also the issue of social justice, language ideologies, and so on. I mean, the art performance and translation, also how translation plays a role in those contexts. So it's a handbook on the social linguistics of protesting. Protesting is taken as the umbrella term. How does how platform protesting is viewed, evaluated. Is it viewed as a revolution? Is it viewed as reform from whose perspective, and so on? This is one of the aims of this project. Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, these actually colleagues who have thankfully expressed interest in the project so far. There are 20 colleagues from different parts of the world, representing different, or at least they intend to address different contexts of protesting, different forms also of protesting. They're from Sudan, from the Arab world, from the West, from Asia, from different parts. But most important thing is not the nationality, but the context which they intend to address. And the list is still open, so we invite actually. Now the deadlines are still the same, but we have a daily deadline for the expression of interest. The abstract submission is 3rd of November, which is like a month and a week. And then we expect the chapters to be submitted chapters by the 3rd of April, and the reviewing process to be completed by the 3rd of June. We have like around six months to write the chapter, and the envisioned publication date for the project is September 2021. So this is a quick update. Christine, do you want to add anything? Thank you.
Thank you, Ashraf. I would just like to encourage our colleagues to send their proposals so that we can have a broad perspective. And that's all. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tommaso, for the great talk today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.